those models into the market. So it is a symbol.
A 25% tariff on all cars that are not made in the United States.
The president will be implementing tomorrow a 25% tariff.
Kia didn't pause production. They pulled the plug on an entire workforce, an entire city, and an entire promise to America. No headlines, no debate, just a quiet shutdown that left U.S. assembly lines cold and empty. While executives shake hands overseas, American workers are left asking, were we ever part of the plan? So who made this decision behind closed doors? How deep does this betrayal go? And are other automakers already planning their own exits? Because by the end of this video, you won't just question Kia, you'll question every brand you thought had your back. The plant that went silent. It happened without warning. One morning, the hum of machinery that had defined the rhythm of West Point, Georgia for over a decade was gone. No clanging of assembly arms, no forklifts buzzing across the floor, just silence. The Kia manufacturing plant, once hailed as the symbol of the South's rise in high-tech auto production, had halted operations. Entire shifts were canceled, doors locked, supervisors told workers to wait for updates. And just like that, the town's economic heartbeat flatlined. For the nearly 4,000 employees who worked the floor, the closure was more than a disruption. It was a gut punch. Some had relocated their families to West Point for the promise of stability. Others had spent 15 years building their lives around the promise that Kia's American expansion was permanent. There were rumors, of course, whispers of softening sales, a memo about retooling. But no one expected the doors to simply shut. Within hours, the parking lots were empty. Toolkits were still hanging on pegs. Half-assembled vehicles sat suspended on tracks. And on local radio, stunned workers called in to vent, to cry, to ask the same question over and over again. How could this happen? But the real explosion came in Washington, because this wasn't just about a factory. Trump's tariff ultimatum. President Donald Trump wasted no time responding. Within 72 hours of Kia's plant shutdown announcement, he was on stage at a campaign rally in Pennsylvania, holding nothing back. They want to build in Mexico, they want to build in Korea, fine, but they will not sell those cars here for free, he boomed. Then came the threat, a 200% tariff on any Kia vehicle not made in the United States. It wasn't an idle comment. Trump had made similar threats before and followed through. In 2018, he pressured automakers to abandon Mexican plants. In 2024, he escalated tariffs on Chinese EV components. Now Kia was in the crosshairs. For the company, this was a nightmare. Their global supply chain model relied on importing components, assembling them in Georgia, and scaling profits with U.S. volume. A tariff of this size would wipe out margins on every foreign-made vehicle. And with U.S. operations now frozen, that meant nearly every vehicle. The markets reacted instantly. Their U.S. stock dipped 8% in overnight trading. Dealerships reported customer cancellations. Even South Korea's government scrambled to arrange diplomatic talks, fearing a new trade war that could pull Hyundai and Kia into an economic firestorm. But the rhetoric wasn't just about money. Trump's framing was nationalistic. They betrayed American workers. The optics? Perfect for his base. Here was a foreign company, welcomed with open arms and billions in incentives, now bailing when things got tough. And now Trump was promising punishment. And that was only the opening salvo, because Kia's next move stunned even its allies. Designed to fail, the recall that broke the brand. It was supposed to be a routine fix. Just another safety bulletin in an industry full of them. But for Kia, this recall turned out to be the final crack in an already splintering facade. More than 125,000 vehicles were affected by a defect so dangerous it made national headlines. A brake system failure that could result in complete loss of stopping power. The models involved, some of their most popular U.S. sellers, including the Sorento, the Telluride, and the Sportage. The issue wasn't the recall itself. Defects happen. Components fail. What broke trust was how many had already been reported, years before action was taken. Internal service bulletins suggested engineers had flagged the issue as early as 2021. By the time federal regulators intervened, the defect had caused dozens of crashes and at least 4 reported injuries. What angered drivers the most was Kia's familiar pattern: minimize the problem, issue limited fixes, and deflect responsibility. In this case, they initially claimed the failures were isolated incidents, despite rising complaints from dealerships and customers. Their response? Software patches, vague reassurances, and quietly revised maintenance schedules. There was no full accountability, no nationwide apology, and certainly no compensation plan for affected owners. And that's where the damage became irreversible. The perception wasn't just that Kia had built a flawed product, it was that they knew, waited, and hoped no one would notice. And when the spotlight finally hit, the company blinked. The public response was swift. Used Kia resale values dropped. Insurance premiums rose. Even loyal buyers began rethinking their next purchase. But even worse than the recalls was how the company responded to them. If this is already making you rethink your next car purchase, hit the like button. It helps more drivers see the truth the ads won't tell you. And if you've ever been burned by a brand, drop it in the comments. You're not alone. Kia's spin machine, when PR becomes propaganda. They didn't just fumble the recall, it launched a full-blown public relations counteroffensive that made everything worse. Rather than admit fault, the company leaned hard into damage control. They flooded social media with vague reassurances, commissioned glossy marketing videos about customer safety, and distributed scripted talking points to dealerships instructing staff to downplay the issue. The result was not reassurance, it was rage. Customers began circulating their own stories online. Videos of brake failures, service delays, and stonewalling by corporate offices went viral. On YouTube, a former Kia technician posted a 20-minute expose detailing how internal pressure discouraged mechanics from flagging recurring system issues to higher-ups. He called it corporate censorship in a safety uniform. Rather than address this growing public outcry, they doubled down. Press releases emphasized industry-leading safety technology, while ignoring the actual defect at the center of the controversy. Company spokespeople offered legalese-laced apologies, blaming supply chain inconsistencies and component sourcing volatility for the recall. The message was clear. It wasn't Kia's fault. It was the environment, the suppliers, the users, anyone but the company. That strategy might have worked 10 years ago, but not in the age of TikTok testimonials and Reddit threads filled with first-hand stories. Their PR machine couldn't keep up. Every press statement was met with screenshots of contradictory service memos. Every media interview triggered new backlash from angry customers who felt ignored, gaslit, or flat-out lied to. Kia thought it could spin its way out of this mess. Instead, it painted a bullseye on its own credibility. The brand wasn't just flawed, it had become, in the eyes of many, dishonest. And while the headlines spun, the workers began to organize. The union fights back. In the shadow of the recall disaster and the public relations debacle, a new voice began rising from the factory floor. Workers, once proud to wear the company logo, started rallying under a different banner: solidarity. For years, unionization efforts at Kia's American facilities had been quietly discouraged, with management offering bonuses and benefits in exchange for silence. But this time, the anger was louder than the incentives. It started with a single leaflet distributed outside the West Point, Georgia plant: safety first, not spin. Within weeks, it grew into organized meetings, walkouts, and petitions signed by hundreds of employees. Their demands weren't extreme: fair safety standards, accountability for defective parts, and transparency about production plans. But even modest demands met resistance from corporate. That resistance only strengthened worker resolve. When news leaked that layoffs might be imminent and that production would soon shift further toward Mexican plants, employees realized they had nothing left to lose. They began collaborating with national unions, bringing in legal advisors and labor organizers. Kia responded with thinly veiled threats: reduced hours, reassignments, and productivity audits aimed at vocal employees. But it was too late. The movement had momentum. What made this wave different was its framing. It wasn't just about wages, it was about identity. Workers felt betrayed not just by Kia's product decisions, but by its entire strategy. They weren't just building cars, they were propping up a brand that had turned its back on them. And as union banners began appearing outside dealership showrooms, customers noticed. The brand wasn't just in trouble, it was being actively challenged from within. While they marched outside, they were already packing up inside. The EV subsidy Kia never got. If there was one moment that crystallized their downfall, it was the realization that their flagship electric vehicles wouldn't qualify for the new U.S. federal tax credits. Passed as part of the 2023 Inflation Reduction Act, the new credits were designed to promote American-made battery electric vehicles. using domestic or friendly sourced materials. Kia's problem: their batteries were not sourced from North America. Their vehicles weren't assembled in unionized plants, and their components relied heavily on Chinese supply chains. The result was devastating. Zero eligibility for the $7,500 consumer credit that many buyers had counted on. The exclusion stunned their marketing team. Months of campaign materials suddenly became irrelevant. Customers began canceling orders. Dealerships reported a sudden spike in abandoned financing applications. Competing automakers like Tesla and GM, whose vehicles did qualify, leaned into the gap, slashing prices and siphoning away prospective Kia buyers. What made the situation worse was their tone-deaf response. Rather than acknowledging the issue and adjusting strategy, the company attempted to lobby for an exception. Executives argued that since Kia was investing in future U.S. plants, their models should count. Lawmakers rejected the plea, calling it premature and unsubstantiated. The damage extended far beyond tax credits. Their exclusion from the EV boom confirmed what critics had warned for years. The company was not ready for a made-in-America future. It had built a global strategy, but ignored the political winds shifting inside the U.S., and now the cost of that oversight was being passed to consumers in the form of higher sticker prices, and no federal relief. Meanwhile, across the border, Mexico was rolling out the red carpet. Made in Mexico. The shift Kia can't reverse. Kia did not build its empire on American soil. It borrowed it, and now it's pulling out. The decision to move production of key models to Mexico was not made overnight, but the consequences arrived in an instant. Georgia's West Point plant, once a symbol of Korean-American industrial synergy, now stands as a monument to what was. Workers laid off, suppliers ghosted, and the hum of production silenced in favor of cheaper labor just across the border. This wasn't just cost-cutting, it was strategy, hard-nosed and brutally efficient. Under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, companies like Kia gain massive tariff advantages by operating in Mexico while still enjoying access to the U.S. market. Low wages, friendly regulations, and relaxed environmental rules have created an irresistible proposition for automakers navigating a global slowdown. But with that strategy comes risk. Moving operations abroad erodes goodwill faster than it saves money. Local governments that once bent over backwards to welcome foreign investment are now watching jobs vanish. And once production lines go south, they rarely return. What looked like short-term efficiency may become long-term abandonment. The optics are damning. In a moment when U.S. manufacturing is being held up as a matter of national identity, Kia's relocation doesn't look smart, it looks disloyal. And the global media took notice. Because this wasn't just their logistical pivot, this was a geopolitical signal. And while Mexico welcomed their business with open arms, the U.S. government reached for something much heavier: retaliation. America responds. Tariffs, lawsuits, and leverage. The gloves came off fast. Within 48 hours of their Mexico announcement, Capitol Hill erupted with calls for an economic counterstrike, senator letters, emergency tariffs, lawsuits under review. What had been a manufacturing decision was now a national insult. The Trump administration, under pressure from unions and industry groups, began exploring retaliatory tariffs on imported vehicles assembled outside U.S. borders, even those technically compliant under NAFTA's successor. But it wasn't just tariffs. Multiple class action lawsuits were filed against Kia, alleging consumer fraud and price manipulation tied to supply constraints and canceled U.S. orders. Dealers accused the company of misleading inventory forecasts and favoring Mexican output over American contracts. In the background, the United Auto Workers Union threatened a boycott of future Kia models not built domestically. What made the political backlash especially volatile was its bipartisan tone. Both Republicans and Democrats saw opportunity in confronting a foreign automaker that turned its back on U.S. jobs. The result? A legislative storm targeting foreign-built electric vehicles, emissions exemptions, and trade loopholes. And Kia, once a fringe player in American auto politics, was now the poster child for economic betrayal. The stakes shifted. No longer was this just about one company's decision. It was a referendum on foreign manufacturing itself. News cycles lit up with phrases like American sovereignty, outsourcing crisis, and corporate sabotage. Analysts warned that tit-for-tat tariffs could disrupt the fragile post-pandemic supply balance. Kia had moved to Mexico for stability, but instead it had triggered a chain reaction that would destabilize its global position. And just as the legal dust began to settle, a new tension was brewing on the other side of the Pacific. Korea's dilemma. The alliance strains. Kia's problem wasn't just economic, it was diplomatic. As American outrage grew, so did pressure on the Korean government to intervene. Seoul, long reliant on the strength of its U.S. alliance, suddenly found itself stuck between trade loyalty and political damage control. National headlines in Korea posed an uncomfortable question. Was Kia jeopardizing the national brand? The South Korean Ministry of Trade issued a carefully worded statement defending Kia's global competitiveness. But behind closed doors, officials scrambled to keep the White House from escalating tensions. Korean exports had already been strained by tariffs on steel, batteries, and semiconductors. Now an auto war threatened to drag the entire bilateral relationship into unknown territory. Korean automakers were watching nervously. Hyundai, which shares global supply lines with Kia, began quietly rerouting shipments to avoid potential inspection delays at U.S. ports. Meanwhile, Samsung and LG, heavy investors in American battery plants, sought private assurances that their operations would remain untouched by the backlash. The situation exposed a deeper fracture. For years, Korea had walked a careful line, benefiting from free trade with the U.S., while expanding its industrial footprint in lower-cost regions like Vietnam and Mexico. Kia's move broke that illusion. It forced a diplomatic reckoning over what the U.S.-Korea economic relationship really meant. And back in America, ordinary buyers started asking an even simpler question: can we still trust Kia? Because while governments negotiated damage control, the real fallout was about to hit at the dealership. The supply chain breaks, and so does trust. The emails started trickling in first. Shipment delayed, production paused, model unavailable. Then the phones stopped ringing. By the third week of the shutdown, Kia dealers across the country had entered panic mode. Orders couldn't be fulfilled, parts weren't arriving. Cars scheduled for delivery were stuck in limbo, some still sitting on Mexican rail cars waiting for customs clearance. For the average American consumer, this was more than a nuisance. This was betrayal. Buyers who had pre-ordered new models with promised delivery dates found themselves waiting indefinitely, with little transparency and zero recourse. Service departments couldn't get replacement parts for recalled vehicles. Even routine maintenance appointments had to be rescheduled due to part shortages. Trust broke fast. Kia's brand, once praised for offering solid value, began trending on forums and social media for all the wrong reasons. Stories surfaced of customers canceling orders. Used car buyers reconsidered purchases due to fears over parts availability and warranty coverage. The resale market buckled. Overnight, the value of certain Kia models dropped by thousands of dollars. Internally, panic spread. U.S. regional managers begged for inventory. Dealerships started discounting showroom cars to clear frozen stock. Meanwhile, suppliers were going unpaid. Logistics partners filed breach of contract notices, and independent transporters reported abandoned loads. All because the supply chain wasn't just tight, it was collapsing. And as Kia scrambled to stabilize logistics and reassure customers, the real question emerged like a thunderclap through the industry. If this could happen to Kia, who's next? Because when customers start walking away, not just from a model but from a brand, recovery isn't just hard, it's sometimes impossible. The brand loyalty collapse. For years, Kia was quietly winning the hearts of American drivers. It was not flashy, not iconic, but it was consistent, offering reliable engineering at a price most families could stomach. Buyers came for the affordability, stayed for the surprising quality, and returned for the 10-year warranty. It was a value proposition that felt personal. But when Kia pulled the plug on its U.S. production, something broke that went far deeper than supply chains. It was loyalty, and it's not coming back. Brand loyalty in the automotive world is rarely about specs. It's about identity, emotional history, and the belief that a company will be there when things go wrong. Kia's decision to abandon its American factory lines sent a clear message. That belief was misplaced. For the thousands who bought Kias expecting parts availability, regional servicing, and resale safety nets, it felt like betrayal. When the shutdown headlines hit, online forums lit up. Reddit threads titled, "I'll never buy another Kia," trended for days. Facebook groups once filled with proud Sportage and Sorento owners transformed into spaces of confusion and resentment. This wasn't just anger. It was heartbreak. Drivers who had never considered another brand were now test driving Mazdas, Subarus, and Chevrolets. Lease return rates on Kia vehicles spiked nearly 14% in just 1 quarter. The switch wasn't quiet. It was public, and it was cultural. In marketing terms, Kia's collapse triggered what brand psychologists call an identity disintegration event, when loyal customers stop seeing themselves reflected in the brand's values. And when that happens, recovery isn't about incentives or trade-in bonuses. It's about trust. And trust, once broken, rarely rebuilds itself. But the emotional rupture was only part of the story. Because while buyers walked away from new Kias, what happened to their existing vehicles was even more devastating. When resale value vanishes overnight, for millions of current Kia owners, the collapse didn't just hit emotionally, it hit their wallets. Resale value, once a minor concern for budget-conscious buyers, became an overnight nightmare. Almost immediately after the production halt and tariff retaliation announcements, the used Kia market went into freefall. Within weeks, models like the Telluride and Fort lost between 17 and 24% of their trade-in value. And it wasn't just theoretical. Dealerships stopped accepting certain Kia models altogether. Certified pre-owned inventory was quietly removed from websites. Even Carvana and CarMax reduced appraisal offers for Kia vehicles by thousands of dollars in a matter of days. Owners found themselves in a brutal bind. Trading in would mean swallowing massive losses, but holding on could be worse if parts and support started to vanish. Online marketplaces reflected the panic. Sorrentos that had been listed for $15,000 were suddenly being relisted for $11,000. Lease buyout departments received an avalanche of early payoff inquiries. Banks flagged Kia depreciation as volatile, triggering adjustments to lending terms for used units. For owners who had chosen Kia for long-term affordability, it was a cruel reversal. The very cars they bought to escape financial strain had become liabilities. It was not just about money. It was about erosion of confidence. One day, a family SUV felt like a stable investment. The next, it was a financial trap. And when consumers begin to fear the future value of their vehicles, they don't just turn away from the brand. They warn everyone they know to do the same. Yet as the resale value plummeted, a bigger fear began to spread. What if Kia was just the first domino? The domino threat? Who's next? Their collapse wasn't just a one-off incident. It was a signal flare, and the message it sent through the auto industry was simple. The economic rules have changed. If one of the world's most cost-efficient manufacturers could be brought down by tariffs, supply shocks, and political backlash, then no brand is safe. Hyundai, Kia's corporate sibling, immediately felt the pressure. Although its operations remained stable, its exposure to similar tariff structures and shared supply chains triggered investor concerns. Hyundai dealerships saw a dip in foot traffic, particularly among buyers worried about brand adjacency, the fear that Hyundai might follow Kia's path. Then came General Motors. With several cross-border assembly operations and heavy reliance on Chinese electronic components, GM found itself back in the headlines. Analysts began asking tough questions about whether it could maintain American production without similar cost-cutting moves. Stock volatility reflected the unease. Even Volkswagen, despite its global presence and electric vehicle investments, came under scrutiny. Its Tennessee plant was praised for resilience, but concerns rose about component delays from Mexico and Eastern Europe. The market was skittish. The risk wasn't collapse, it was contagion. Every automaker suddenly had to reassure consumers and investors that they weren't the next Kia. This new instability triggered quiet meetings across Detroit, Seoul, and Stuttgart. Strategic roadmaps were reevaluated. Export plans were rewritten. Tariff stress tests, once theoretical drills, became urgent action items. The industry had entered a new era, one defined not by innovation alone, but by geopolitical navigation. And for the average buyer, that meant facing a much harder question than which car to choose. The riders left behind. When corporations collapse or shift, they rarely look back. But the consumers they leave behind, they're the ones holding the keys to cars no longer supported, warranties no longer honored, and financing plans based on values that no longer exist. For these riders, it's not just about inconvenience. It's about survival in a marketplace that feels like it's constantly shifting beneath their feet. So what should the average driver do in a world where automakers can disappear or be destabilized overnight? The first answer is brutal honesty. Loyalty means nothing if the company isn't loyal to you. Research should go deeper than price and horsepower into trade policies, production footprints, and subsidy eligibility. If a car company doesn't build in your country, insure in your country, or employ in your country, it may not protect your long-term interests. Second, buyers must reconsider what value actually means. Is it the purchase price, the cost of maintenance, the likelihood of recalls, the ability to get parts 5 years from now? In this climate, a cheap car with no future resale or support may be more expensive in the long run than a pricier vehicle with long-term backing. And finally, consumers must think like strategists, not just shoppers. Look for brands that invest in local production, that support right-to-repair movements, and that communicate transparently in crises. Your purchase is a vote, not just for a car, but for an ecosystem of jobs, support, and accountability. Kia's collapse left thousands stranded, not because they made bad choices, but because they trusted a brand that no longer understood the weight of that trust. Now the road ahead demands a new kind of rider, one who asks more, expects more, and refuses to be left behind. Their exit isn't just about one brand. It's a warning. If you want to stay ahead of what's collapsing next, hit subscribe, drop a comment with your biggest automotive regret, and smash that like button before the next factory goes dark.